Welcome back to Bunny Banter, the first and only podcast for everything Killer Bunnies. Although I'm not sure if we can say first and only anymore since Creator Chit Chat happened a week and a half ago, but we won't count them.
I'm supposed to keep everything. Never
No,
mind.
no, Glenn and Kathy are great. But anyways, I'm your host Matt, here with co-host Mikey,
Hello.
and as a guest today we have a good friend Travis.
Hello.
What are we talking about today, Mikey?
Neutral strategy. Article 10 of the Bunny Banter Catechism.
Article 10, neutral strategy. Yep. So last episode we discussed aggressive strategy. So it's quite natural that the next episode would be on neutral strategy, which is often viewed as the counter to aggressive strategy. We have Travis on today as he is one of our lead researchers on the neutral strategy.
Yes, sir.
A bit of background information. Although when we're talking about neutral strategy, we'll often talk about it in terms of the hybrid strategies, actually, the strategies of passive neutral and neutral aggressive, which are very common within the community. Today, we're just talking about what we consider pure neutral strategies, which of course are recognized by usually playing medium value cards and in general being fair, although there are some cases where that description is lacking. So let's get right into the first strategy here. First one I want to talk about I call the just war, and I think it's a very common strategy for players to discover. What it is it's a targeted strategy in which the player forms a temporary alliance with other opponents to target an excessively aggressive opponent. So it's very common for if one opponent is being way too far ahead, they have twice as many cards as anyone else, they have a triplet and a rank and all of that nonsense. It's very common for a few players to temporarily ally against that one opponent.
Matt.
How often have you seen this strategy used, Travis?
Well, pretty much every single game I'm in with you. Sometimes, unless we have like a whole bunch of passive players, like Frank and what was her name?
Clarissa.
Or she just had or she
Kara.
just did nothing. It was just she had all her cards in a row, and that was it. Two passive
Kara
players,
did that for a while,
me a
yeah.
neutral player, and there was you aggressive, and some Tyler wasn't there yet, so it's like so yeah, no real alliance there, but yeah, usually it's when we have a bigger group, everyone kind of gangs up on you because you know the game a little bit too well in the eyes of many, and everyone usually targets you as soon as you have the vast majority of the bunnies at that point.
Yeah, we actually talked about that situation in the aggressive discussion where a player's reputation is enough for them to be considered aggressive.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Always quite fun. So Just War will often be used in that scenario where either the owner of the game or the person who's known to win the most will often be targeted more excessively because of it. How often do you see the Just War strategy, Mikey?
Well, I used to see it a lot when everybody played neutral, or a majority of people played neutral. In the first games that I played, you would be me and Hayden or something, and sometimes Hayden would play aggressive, but generally you would be the most aggressive, and then everybody else would be playing kind of neutral. But now we've gotten into this whole thing where in the games that I play, most everybody plays passive, or a majority of people play passive. So now you don't necessarily see the just war in the idea or in the sense that it's neutral strategy. I suppose you could kind of see the idea of just war with majority of people playing passive. They're kind of forming an alliance with everybody. I guess it's not necessarily targeting the aggressive opponent, but yeah, I don't see it as much in these as I used to. But it is quite popular.
Yeah, it is true with all the passive players recently. It kind of I don't know how to describe it. It's like I completely forgot where I was going with that. Never mind. Ignore me.
Yeah, it's a very good point that the Just War strategy does require an aggressive player or one or two aggressive players to be in the mix. And if the meta is currently passive, it's not one that you're going to see too much of. But most metas these days are probably primarily neutral slash aggressive. Our group for a while there was more of an exception. I think the passive strategy is quite uncommon. Maybe it'll become more common once we get to that discussion. But the fun thing with our group is I'm actually starting to see it transition more towards an aggressive state once again. So we'll see. We'll
Ooh.
see what happens with the. We'll see how fast people start playing neutral strategies again. It's a constantly shifting meta there. Okay. Is there anything else that we want to say on the Just War strategy before we move on here?
Hmm. No, I think we're good.
Okay. Yeah. It's just a pretty standard neutral strategy, very well proven, very effective against aggressive opponents. So moving on here, we have a strategy used by Jeff himself.
Ooh.
We're going to talk
Oh.
about what I call the Hermit. And the Hermit is a neutral economic strategy in which the player avoids social interaction aspects and hopes to be ignored and forgotten by his opponents. So Jeff often talks about how he's more or less forced to use aggressive strategy because of his reputation as the creator of the game. People are likely going to target him anyways, so there's no benefits to using neutral or passive strategies quite often. But he's also mentioned that in some games where he's more or less being ignored, he'll kind of just sit in the background and just kind of do his own thing, and which is exactly what the Hermit describes. Is the goal of the Hermit is to be completely forgotten to the point where they don't even know you're playing the game anymore. You're just sitting there, you're just gathering carrots, you're making no big deal about anything, you're not targeting anyone specifically, you're not engaging in trades. It's an interesting strategy. It's been shown to be pretty effective. Uh, it's very difficult to tell if someone is actually intentionally using the strategy or if they just don't find the social interaction fun. There's a thin line there. uh, how often have you seen this strategy used, Mikey?
Hmm. I'm not sure if I necessarily see it a lot. I think there have been times where I've unintentionally, well, I've intentionally done this, but not because I thought, oh, this is a good strategy. I generally tended to do it because I was upset. Because there'll be times where you're targeted. I'll be targeted, and then I'll just avoid all social interaction. I'll just play, not necessarily passive, but I'll just play my own thing and not necessarily do much to make myself a target anymore because I'm angry generally. So I don't know if I've ever seen this play done by another player, but perhaps that's because I haven't noticed because they are a hermit.
Dun dun dun.
That's a very good point there, is that oftentimes this strategy might be being used, but if you don't notice it, that means it's being used successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do notice it, then at that point you have a decision point. Do you actually want to target this person who's quote unquote not playing the game? Or do you just leave them off to their own thing, knowing that they probably won't target you, more or less? It really depends on exactly how they're using it, but the non-interaction aspects are very interesting when done intentionally. Oftentimes they're
Mm-hmm.
done for other reasons, like you mentioned, you were just upset that game.
Yep.
Have you ever seen this strategy, Travis?
Personally, no. I don't think I've ever seen someone do this, unless, like Mikey is saying, it is completely oblivious. We don't see the person do this. I would probably say elements, though. We've seen elements of this. Like with Mikey was saying when he got very angry. Like I would think of a situation like, say I lost all my bunnies. Like I had like a triplet and I was doing pretty good. And next thing I know, someone launches a nuke on me. I'll be like, oh, just get all flustered and mad. I'm like, fine, whatever. And I just kind of step back for a little bit. And in the sense of that, but I don't think I've seen a real full hermit gameplay.
Yeah, that's another great point, is that this is often a go-to transition from after playing an aggressive strategy like the freight train, where all of a sudden you have the triplet in the rank and then you lose all of it. It's a very common transition to go into this hermit-like state where you're just trying to avoid the social interaction because everyone's maybe still mad at you for having all that advantage, even though you've now lost it.
Try to secretly rebuild behind the curtain.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, I think it's always difficult to tell. I have seen players who have avoided the social interaction throughout an entire game of full set. And it's always difficult to tell if they actually are intentionally using this strategy, or if they decide, or if they're just in a bad mood and really didn't want to play full set and just kind of not into the game. You know, they're probably saying on their phones during the process because they're not going to trade with anyone anyways, and you never actually know if they're doing it for strategic reasons or if they're doing it for emotional reasons.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting strategy, and like I said, it is used by Jeff himself at times, or at least at least a form of it is used by Jeff. So it must be good, right?
Yeah.
Possibility. Maybe I'll try it next time.
Yeah,
Dun, dun,
maybe.
dun.
Spooky strategies. It's a pretty well proven strategy if you can pull it off. Um, Although the weakness of it is when some players would consider the lack of trading to be an aggressive thing, and that seems arbitrary. But for example, if you had a prune Danish and somebody offered you a trade for it, and you just don't really want to mess with the social interaction, so you just reject all trade offers, even if they're in your favor, then the hermit can turn into looking aggressive, even though it's meant to be neutral.
Mm.
That's
Mhm.
often the difficulty with neutral strategy, is that oftentimes it can be portrayed as aggressive strategy if not executed correctly. So it's always high skill testing to see exactly how much social interaction do you want to avoid, and when is it necessary to accept a few trades here and there, while still trying to remain unnoticed, but also trying to make sure that the other players don't think you're exploiting this strategy.
Mm.
It's always a careful
Mm.
balancing act there. Is there anything else that we want to say on the hermit strategy before we move on to Travis, the strategy that Travis is famous for?
Ooh. I think we're good with the hermit.
Okay, so now moving on to a strategy that we like to call 5D chess. It is a strategy that Travis is well known for in our group. It's an economic and targeted strategy in which the player rapidly transitions between all categories of strategies to keep his opponents guessing. So it's
Always keep them
yeah,
guessing, son.
it's not uncommon for players to transition their strategies. We just mentioned that if a player who's playing the freight train strategy of aggressive all of a sudden gets wiped out, it's very common for them to transition to more of like a hermit strategy, and that's all well proven and is seen quite often. The 5D chess is very unique in that the transitions happen at very frequent times and for seemingly no reason. So you want to talk about a little bit more about that, Travis?
Yeah, so basically, going into a neutral game with 5D chess, you want to think about what your action is. You want to win, but you also, at the same time, want to have fun with it. So the whole transition of a 5D chess is I'm going to play the game, and I'm going to make sure nobody knows what I'm going to be doing, right? Nobody knows what I'm doing, and I'm going to just be a spontaneous person. I can't really put it into better words, but it's to use every available resource to your advantage and just always keep them guessing. And also, just it doesn't have to do with cards either. It can see how you act. I'm sure, Matt, you've seen the
Oh
way I
yeah.
act when I play the 5D chess neutral strategy. I'm very how would you describe me during that
Unstable.
time? Unstable. Let's go with that. I'm very unstable. I'll be very quiet one moment, and then I'll be like, "Oh, boys, you don't even know what's about to hit you," and I hit you with like the randomest thing that does nothing to you, but you're in this sense of fear. It's like, oh, what's he doing? What's he doing? And it's probably the most fun I'm gonna have in Killer Bunnies, if I'm gonna be completely honest. It's
Oh
probably the
yeah.
most fun you'll ever have.
It is definitely a quite fun strategy that I'd recommend everyone to try at some point. Uh, it is very high skill though, because with such frequent transitions, sure your opponents have no idea what's coming, but then the danger is that they're always assume the worst.
Yes, indeed, and
So,
that leads to like the social interaction of it as well. Because I know I've noticed a couple of times now you've immediately come to me to make like a non-aggression pact,
oh yeah.
just to avoid the wrath of a random weapon being played on you or a random feed the bunny.
Yeah, it's been very
What was it?
common.
What was it last game? You put like a barrier between me or
Oh
something. It
yeah,
was a card. I
I
can't
played the
remember.
Jarnac turn one on Travis, just
Oh,
to make sure that none of the 5D chess shenanigans would happen against me.
And to be completely honest, that's kind of I'm like, yes, I don't have to worry about Matt either now.
Yeah, it was
uh,
definitely mutually beneficial in that game. I think that was a
I
four
think it
player
was.
context, and then it turned into five, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
Yep. Tyler joined late.
yep. I do believe you won that game.
Yeah, I did the second game, not the first one though. You won in like the first 30
The
minutes of on full set,
Frank won.
surprisingly.
Frank won. I could have won if I would have been smart about that, but I forgot to sell my medals.
No, I thought you in that game you played a card,
I
you
ended the
rolled the
game
dice.
early, but Frank got all the remaining carrots
Oh yeah, that's
because I
right.
forgot to sell my medals. I had played Tivitellos to end the game early and got it was a 1 in 10 chance at the time, and I happened to get it. uh,
Yeah, but then the second game where you put the barrier up, I won that one. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. The Jarnac one you won. I think you had quite a few carrots. I think you had 28 out of 54 or something like that, which is quite a lot. um,
Yay, full set. I think that was my first. No, that was the second game of full set I've ever
uh,
played.
That would have been third if we count. Yeah, third if we count the Tivitellos game, because we played the 2 days before.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yep. Yeah, 5D chess is such an interesting strategy with how quickly these players transition. One moment they're playing pure aggressive strategies and using all of the backstabs and all of that fun stuff, and then the very next moment, it could be the very next turn. It might not even be their next turn, it could be the opponent's next turn. They'll all of a sudden be playing a passive strategy where they're just giving their stuff away and they're just having a great time and nobody knows ever what to expect of them. And the reason we put in pure neutral is because on average you will be playing the neutral strategy. You could of course play 5D chess in another context where on average you'd be playing neutral aggressive or passive neutral, but usually it's on average neutral in pure's form.
Hmm. There is one underlying fact and rule that I follow with 5G chess that is completely neutral. The Kinder Bunnies may never be targeted.
That's actually aggressive passive. More on that strategy in 4 episodes from now. Oh, trust me. Trust me, I'll give a little bit of hints. There is an aggressive passive strategy regarding the Kinder Bunnies. I call it Kinder Protection Services. It is, as an aggressive passive strategy, it is very sinister in nature. It seems neutral, but it is quite sinister. How about you, Mikey? What do you think about 5D chess?
I don't know if I've ever seen it happen.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had Mikey in a game with 5D
Yeah,
chess.
probably not. Yeah.
It
So,
seems I'm surprised, honestly, that it's not aggressive.
it's often portrayed as aggressive. Because often within 5D chess, you'll have things that look like backstabs.
I
Where you
feel like in Killer Bunnies, things are the opposite as they should be in real life, whereas in real life, the intent should be what matters, not necessarily the outcome or how somebody reacts to it. However, in Killer Bunnies, I feel like the outcome or how it appears is actually what it should be labeled as.
that's a very good point.
That
That there
was that
there
was so that was. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
yeah there is a aspect of we can label these strategies as they intend to be, which is how we're doing it here. 5D chess intends to be a neutral strategy primarily, on average.
Mm-hmm.
However, in some groups, it might be considered aggressive, or at least it'll be viewed as that. The and I see where you're coming from, Mikey, is saying that perhaps we should label strategies as they are portrayed in game. There's a few
Mm-hmm.
difficulties with that, however, one of which being the difference between groups. For example, in a pure passive group, neutral strategies would be considered aggressive, and then the passive strategies would be the new neutral, in some sense.
Uh-huh.
In some sense,
Yeah.
the way we list it more or less assumes that all the strategies exist.
Yeah.
However, the other difficulty that's even more noticeable is it's often a valid strategy to
Uh-huh.
portray strategies as what they aren't. We often
Mm-hmm.
place those types of social strategies within neutral aggressive, such which we will discuss a few episodes from now, which involve portraying as many opponents as you can as aggressive while portraying yourself as passive, even though in
Yep.
reality you're possibly being more aggressive than them. It's just a matter of how
Yep.
much you can manipulate the views on the strategies being used.
Mm-hmm.
It's why the Kinder Protection Services works as a strategy. It's very sinister in nature, but it
Mm-hmm.
does synergize with passive strategy, and it
Yep.
does punish aggressive strategy. So it seems noble in character, when in
Mm-hmm.
reality it is very selfish in its intentions as an
Mm-hmm.
aggressive passive strategy. But yes, that is a very good point. That 5D chess with unpredictable opponents will often be portrayed as aggressive. I have declared Travis to be an aggressive player before in
Mm-hmm.
mid game, even though in reality I recognize him to be a neutral player.
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of the thing with 5D chess is it is somewhat reactional. So it's like he did this, like with the kind of goes back to the whole just war. Oh, Matt's winning. Time to target him nonstop.
Yep.
Yeah, it really is meant for a player who will not tunnel vision on one specific strategy. It's very common, for, at least in our groups, for players to say, okay, this game I'm going to play passive. And then they should stick with that strategy throughout the whole game. Maybe they transition once throughout the whole game
Mm-hmm.
and then start playing a close strategy. Maybe they'll switch from passive neutral to neutral, and that's about as far as they get. The 5D
Yep.
chess player is very opportunistic, where he'll use whatever situation comes up. He will instantly change his strategy regardless of what reputation might happen. If there's an opportunity to be aggressive and Travis sees it as a good opportunity, he'll use it. For example, making a non-aggression pact with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize that same opportunity. I make a non-aggression pact with Travis, except I do so in an aggressive context, at least recently, where I know that Travis is one of the neutral players, so naturally Travis would be a threat to me using aggressive strategy if that's what I'm currently using. So therefore, if I can form that non-aggression pact, then sure, we both benefit off of it. But otherwise, I probably would have maybe not had as many opportunities as I would have that game. So 5D chess it's a very complicated strategy to play correctly, because if you ever start playing too much on the aggressive side of things, then you're probably going to be viewed as aggressive. The hope is with 5D chess is to be viewed as a neutral player.
And always keep them guessing.
And always keep them guessing.
That's the catchphrase of 5D chess. Always keep them guessing.
You're just playing passive for 5 turns, and then on the 6th turn you play a nuclear warhead. Always keep them guessing.
Yep. Everyone's playing Killer Bunnies. Nope, you're playing 5D chess. You're on a different level at that point.
Oh yeah. You have surpassed all of our strategies by using all of them at the same time. Oh yeah, it's quite fun. I highly recommend, out of all the strategies we're discussing today, I highly recommend trying that one out just to see how much fun it is. Not so much that it's an easy strategy to learn. It takes a lot of practice to get good at 5D chess, but it sure is fun even if you're bad at it. Anything else we want to say on 5D chess before we move on to the strategy that I'm a big fan of on this list, because I discovered it within the past couple of weeks?
I think we're good.
Okay. So let me give some background information for the next strategy here, which I like to call the perfect top deck. It has a few variants to it. So I can't remember who gave me the inspiration for it, but it was someone on the Discord who described how sometimes he would, instead of choosing a card from his hand, just play the card that he draws, so that his opponents, quote unquote, couldn't blame him for playing the nuclear warhead, for example. Of course, he still had the option to discard the card, but just for the sake of this strategy, we usually ignore that option. Usually, if a person is playing this strategy, they will promise to play a card if they are able. So therefore, I took that idea and decided to put it on a much larger scale and apply it throughout the entire game. So the idea is, from start to finish in the game, you will not play any cards directly from your hand. Instead, you only play the cards as you draw them. Now, why on earth does that work is the question. It sounds completely counterintuitive. Why would I not want to look at my hand and choose the card that's correct for the situation? That's the question, right? There is reasoning behind it, and there's a few reasons. The first reason, which is the primary reason, is recall that neutral strategy is founded on, for the most part, playing medium value cards. Okay? So, on average, you will draw a medium value card. On average. It's not always going to be a card that's relevant for the scenario, but maybe one turn you'll draw a nuclear warhead that's a high value card. Maybe one turn you'll draw free cabbage from Killer Bunnies. You get to draw one cabbage card. That's a low value card. So on average, just relatively based on how the deck is, no matter the expansions, you will draw a medium value card. So therefore, If you play the perfect top deck strategy throughout the whole game, where you're only playing the top card you draw, you are quote unquote statistically guaranteed to be within pure neutral by playing medium value cards.
Hmm.
So there's the social benefit in the sense that in an aggressive meta, you will be considered neutral. And that is a very strong thing to be considered in an aggressive meta because people won't necessarily target you because of it. You drew the cards, and if you play a nuclear warhead, it wasn't your own fault. You promised to play every card that you draw. Just starting with that, let's get some thoughts on it. What do you think, Travis?
Oh, a lot to take in. I'm gonna be completely honest with you, I completely blanked out on that.
So I am only playing the card that I draw. I'm never touching my hand. Is that viable?
Eh, in, in a way, I could probably see the whole trading aspect of it.
Yep.
You
And
know,
we'll get to that as soon as I discuss open hand here, but for now, just the top deck part, isolated.
just the top deck isolated. Is it a viable strategy? I guess if it's, I don't know, it feels kind of luck based
You would
in a
think.
way.
You would think. And in some senses it is, because although cards will be medium value on average, they're not necessarily good for the scenario. So what usually ends up happening is if for example, if you lose all your bunnies, at that point, most of the deck is completely useless for top decking. Uh,
Yeah.
but for the sake of argument, if you have a bunny, most cards are playable. Most cards. They're not necessarily optimal, but they're playable. So most cards will be medium value, and the hope is that if you're playing this neutral strategy, people won't necessarily target you. That's the hope. Doesn't always happen, but that is the hope. So in that context, there is still an aspect of luck of the draw, of course.
Yeah.
But from my few times I've tested it maybe 5 games now, 6, something like that. And Frank has tested it a few times as well. I think he's tested it 4 times. It does work better than you would expect initially.
Really?
Yeah, it's quite surprising. I
Huh.
think the first game I played it, if I remember correctly, I got 6 carrots out of 15 in Remix in a 5-player game.
Oh
So I
wow.
got twice the amount of carrots than I was expecting. On average, these players get 3. I got twice because no one targeted me, even though I was doing my top decks. Even when I had good top decks, still no one targeted me. So perhaps in certain groups it can work.
Hmm.
What do you think, Mikey?
You know, I think I've seen you do this before, and it would seem like a viable strategy. However, I had an idea just now. A wonderful way to target somebody who's doing this is I guess, to attack somebody who's doing this, is just to target them. Is
Pretty
just
much.
start laying a bunch of heavy weapons on them and laying down a bunch of um, feed the bunnies and stuff. Because if they're going to be true to their strategy, they're not going to. So obviously, if they're going to be true to the strategy, they're not going to change. So if you can trust that that person is not going to change their strategy, you could obliterate them because you just start playing all these high level powered cards on them, and they can't really do anything unless they happen to draw something that will happen to help them. So, from my vantage point, it's nice if somebody else does this. I don't know if I would ever do it. Well, I guess I did technically in that one game,
Yeah,
but
you did one of the
I I
variants
did
that we'll
it,
talk about here in a second.
I did it once where I would generally lay down the card that I drew unless I unless that I knew that I had another card in my hand that I wanted to
I'm
utilize.
I'm getting a new idea for a new game strategy now that I want to test out immediately.
Ooh, you want to share it?
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah,
You'll see
No.
it next Monday.
Oh
I'm
boy,
gonna
I'm
I'm gonna try
scared.
and remember this. I'm gonna try and remember this strategy. It's gonna take an aspect of this play style and combine it with just the game. And I'll go into
Ooh,
more detail later after I try this and just see if it works or not. But it's gonna
I'm
be
excited.
interesting next Monday.
There we
Yeah.
go. This podcast has accomplished what we seek to accomplish with this series, and that is to inspire, not just to share proven strategies, but to inspire players to come up with new strategies within the category. Because there is an
and
infinite amount of strategical exploration in Killer Bunnies.
and but I think the primary goal is to spread the gospel of Jeffrey Bellinger.
Of the passivity meta.
Jeff Bless.
Jeff
Jeff Bless.
bless. Okay. But anyways, Mikey brought up a very good point that the perfect top deck strategy has a very easy counter, and that is if you killed all of their bunnies, statistically, most of the cards that they could play are useless. And all of a sudden, if they're going to remain true to their strategy, you have forced them from a neutral perfect top deck into a passive perfect top deck because now most of the cards that they will draw are low value. Their status of where they're at strategically is therefore dependent on their opponents at that point. So that's a very good point that in certain groups this strategy would be absolutely worthless because they are probably going to target you, and once you're out of bunnies, too bad. You're stuck with your top
Yep.
Yeah.
Game
decks.
over.
Most of them are useless. I've been in that situation. I played a perfect top deck game recently where uh, Chris, who was on last episode, played aggressive strategy very well in terms of the social aspects of it, and villainized something minor that I did, and therefore convinced the third player to target me as well, even though both of them were actually farther ahead than I was. And therefore my perfect top deck strategy was ruined in that I could not get another bunny. So that is a very good point. But in certain groups, as I have demonstrated, probably in primarily passive groups, I would say, or at least passive neutral, you are not likely to get targeted for this type of strategy, even though on average you'll be playing medium value cards. And remember, I mentioned in pure passive groups, neutral strategy will often be considered aggressive. However, this one typically isn't, from my experience. So perhaps this is a good counter to the pure passive meta.
Hmm.
But now that we got that isolated, let's look at the addition to this strategy, which I call open hand. So recall that you are not using your hand. So now the open hand is a perfect top deck in which the player willingly allows opponents to look at and trade with his hand. And the idea is if there is a large variance in the strategies present, there have to be some aggressive players and there have to be some passive players. If you have that, what will happen is you will trade your high value cards to the aggressive players, and they will trade you low value cards in return. And perhaps you ask for some sort of payment like $1 for the opportunity. Maybe. It's not required, but that is an option. And then what now that I have all these low value cards, those are really valuable to the passive strategy. So you trade with the passive players, you trade them your low value cards, and they trade you their high value cards because if they're playing passive, they don't want to play high value cards. So now all of a sudden, you have become some form of market almost. You're almost an extra shop in the game where you just have a consistent source of drawing cards. You have your 5 card hand. At any point, assuming it's their turn or your turn, of course, your opponents could trade with you. And you are very open about what you trade because you're not going to use it anyways. You're very generous with payments if you even accept any payments for the privilege. And now the aggressive players like you because you're giving them high value cards, and hopefully they don't backstab you after that. And the passive players like you because you're giving them low value cards, and the passive players won't backstab you after that. So now, you've essentially, if there is a war going on between passive and aggressive strategies, which there is in some groups, you have become the arms dealer. And if you're funding both sides of the war, if you're selling weapons to both sides of the war, you're going to get pretty rich. Even if you're not accepting any payments, you will still be getting rich socially, because no one's going to target you if you're being that generous to them. And if they ever do target you, you just take away the opportunity. What do you think, Travis?
I'm getting flashbacks to the movie Lord of War right now, where literally the arms dealer just going around all over the world. He's just selling guns to everybody as quickly as he can. That's what you're saying basically. With the aggressive players want your high value cards, and the passive players want your low cards, and it's like flashbacks.
Oh yeah. There's definitely a good analogy between this strategy and an arms dealer. Although it's counterintuitive because if you don't understand the passive strategy, you don't understand how on earth are you trading away these low value cards. But in reality, the passive players desperately want low value cards so that they actually have something to play, but nothing that they would actually be targeted for. What do you think, Mikey, about the open hand strategy?
Ooh, I love this strategy. Not doing it myself, but when other people do it. I must tell the whole world of my new strategy that I came up with.
The
Last
chaos
time
hand?
Okay, so this is a great strategy. I don't know what it's called, and it really doesn't actually do anything. So, I was playing with Matthew, and he did this open hand strategy. And I decided I was going to do something kind of similar, where generally, for the most part, I would take and just lay down whatever the first card it was. But there were actually, no, that's not what I did. I did something totally different. But it's even better. What I would do is I had my 5 card hand. I would go through and I would randomly trade all of the 5 cards that Matthew had laid out with what I had. So maybe sometimes Matt would end up with the same card that he started with because I would just shuffle, trade, shuffle, trade, shuffle, trade, shuffle, trade, shuffle, trade. And then I would randomly pick a card out of my hand and lay it down. That's what I did. And it didn't really do much of anything, but it was fun and it was confusing to people. And I think that's what was most fun about it.
Yeah, thanks.
So I like the open hand strategy because you can do that and
Oh yeah.
make people.
Yeah, thanks to Mikey, we have the other variant of the perfect top deck, which I like to call the chaos hand. And that is
Yay.
very similar to the open hand, where you'll be willingly trading cards from your hand. The difference is you're trading random cards. So the idea is, we had a unique scenario where I was playing open hand and Mikey was playing chaos hand, and it was the first time that scenario has probably ever happened in the history of Killer Bunnies, because probably nobody's playing perfect top deck, and even less players than nobody are playing open hand, and then nobody's playing chaos hand. All of a sudden we have this scenario where Mikey's trading me random cards where I'm trading openly. So we're just trading cards back and forth. It's not really accomplishing anything. But the idea is, and Chaos Hand is admittedly not tested. Open Hand is actually pretty well tested and succeeds in some cases. Chaos Hand, you will offer to an opponent to say, I will trade you any amount of random cards from my hand. And maybe you have them pay for that privilege, maybe you don't. It depends on what context you're playing it under. But the idea is, if you're trading random cards from your hand, and maybe you do it with an agreement that they trade random cards from their hand, then perhaps they think they have low value cards, and then they get higher value cards, and then they're happy with you. But if they get lower value cards, they're probably not too upset with you because you didn't know what you have. You never know what you have. It's always it's a mystery box. You're getting a grab bag instead of the guaranteed, which is exciting. People like loot boxes. We've created a loot box scenario with Killer Bunnies.
when I played that strategy, I wasn't playing pure Chaos Hand because I knew what cards I had in my hand. So if I really liked one, I would put it off to the side, wouldn't trade it with you, and then put it in my run. So I wasn't doing pure Chaos Hand. I did, if there were cards, they weren't ever aggressive cards. But if it was like choose a carrot or something like that, or double no trouble, I would keep them to utilize them for myself.
Mm-hmm. That is a very good point, is that when we're talking about these strategies, we talk about them usually in the pure sense where it's like, oh look, you can do Chaos Hand throughout the whole game, and that works, but oftentimes it's more optimal to play partially Chaos Hand, and then maybe you hybrid a little bit of carrot acceleration into there, and all of a sudden you have a neutral aggressive strategy. And we're not necessarily going to give that neutral aggressive strategy a brand new name because of it, but it is using a neutral strategy and combining it with an aggressive strategy, and all of a sudden you're within the hybrid. So that's a very good point, is that whenever we're talking about these specific strategies, it's always possible to combine aspects from multiple. So just because you're playing open hand doesn't mean that you always have to be willing to trade with an opponent's hand. Maybe someone is ruining your open hand trading mechanism, and so you just leave them out of it for the rest of the game. Or maybe you decide, my top decks aren't that great, I don't have a bunny, it's not working anymore, let me look at my hand, get a bunny, once I get my bunny I'll go back to open top decks. That sort of idea. You never have to play a strategy to its full extent. You can always change things wherever you see it advantageous to do so. Let's see. I feel like there's something else I wanted to say on the open hand, but I can't remember it now. It's a very, very interesting strategy. There was a game where an opponent used it in a pure passive context. And that was Tyler who used it in that context. And the idea was, rather than let's see, how do I explain this? He basically used it in a king-making context, which king-making is actually a valid passive strategy. Surprisingly, it's very commonly viewed as a very toxic part of a game. But in Killer Bunnies, it's usually put within passive because it's actually viable to make your opponent lose. But this form of king-making was very extreme in that Tyler was using an open hand variant where, regardless, he wasn't playing his top decks. He was playing cards in order that he drew them. So the card he draws will be played 7 turns from now, more or less. However, he would also allow any opponents to trade with those cards. He left them wide, completely visible the whole time. And I happened to be the next player after his turn. So what ended up happening was Tyler would draw a good card, and I would trade for that good card and give him a bad card. And all of a sudden, he king made me into a very dangerous, aggressive threat, and I all of a sudden didn't have the weakness of pure aggression and of running out of steam because I was playing two hands basically, more or less. So my hand ended up being a couple bunnies and a couple high value cards, and realistically, no one could do anything about it. And Tyler didn't transition to a more viable strategy throughout the game, so that game was decided. So yeah, that's there's one more thing I want to mention about open hand, and there's two ways you can go about it. The first way is to reveal all the cards that you have in your hand at all times, so that if at any point everyone can see them openly, and at any point if anyone wants to trade for them, they can offer their trades and everyone's happy. The other variant is to have your hand hidden at all times, and if anyone wants to trade with it, they can request to see it, and then they'll trade with it. The very big difference between those two strategies is one, the former supports the passive strategy because they'll be trading for cards. They'll be trading for low value cards, and everyone sees that they're trading for low value cards. A passive player wants everyone to know that they are passive, while the aggressive player probably doesn't want everyone to know that they're going to play aggressive. So even if you have a high value card like the nuclear warhead, if you're revealing that openly and someone trades for it, everyone knows exactly what they are intending. So therefore, many aggressive players will not trade for it.
I suppose here's something though. If you are playing chaotic hand and somebody else is playing open hand, and you get the you take the nuclear warhead, nobody really knows what you're intending, especially if you're playing the way that I play.
Very true. Very
Where
true.
I was selecting random cards, but I was looking at them, and if I liked one, I would keep it. So then it's like, what's he going to do?
That's very true. It's very similar to 5D chess in that sense, where you more or less combine the two, where we never really knew what you were intending to do with the cards that you took. So that is another possibility. I've tested both the cards fully in view and the cards hidden aspects. I'm not sure which one I like better. It's difficult to say. Some aggressive players will want everyone to know that they have the nuclear warhead because they'll use that for intimidation tactics. But other players that want to use it for backstab contexts will not want anyone to know about it. So it depends. It's not necessarily that the full view helps passive players and the hidden view helps aggressive players. Both strategies can actually have ways where it'd be better for it to be hidden or it'd be better for it to be in full view. And so it's difficult to say that one is better over the other in terms of open hand, but it's certainly an interesting interaction. Anything else that we want to say about open hand or chaos hand before we move on to, let's say, one more strategy?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay. Mikey, which strategy of the three we have left do you want to talk about? We have Holy Matrimony, Prophecy, or Russian Roulette.
See, let me read through them real fast. Do 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 do. Do 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 do.
Do 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 do.
Let's talk about Holy Matrimony.
Okay, that was the one I was hoping you'd pick. Okay. So Holy Matrimony is a strategy inspired by Hayden and Clarissa, by the way. Is a strategy.
They're married, by the way.
They are married, which is where the name comes from. It's an economic strategy in which two players share everything they have wherever possible. If one of the players wins, the other considers it a victory. So in a sense, contrary to Just War, which is by definition a temporary alliance as necessary. The holy matrimony is an economic strategy where more or less it's a full alliance throughout the whole duration of the game usually. And the idea is what it usually causes is if two players agree to ally throughout the game, you usually see some other players using just war against them, which is an interesting interaction as well. But the idea is that two players will support each other wherever they need it. You know, if one person needs to feed their bunnies, the other player will trade them Dala or whatever they need. If one person's short a bunny, the other player will trade them a bunny. They usually want to have an equal amount of carrots. And the idea is they're hoping that one of them will win, and if one of them wins, they mentally consider it a victory for themselves. What are your thoughts on that, Mikey?
What's that?
What are your thoughts on this strategy?
I think it's really interesting. I think it's I never really thought of it until the last time we played with Hayden and Clarissa, and they were like looking at each other and talking to each other, and like it was really interesting because they would together collectively decide that they were going to help a specific person. And so it's really cool because they're not only if you're maybe a lowly player in the game and you need help, well, you've got two people helping you. And it's also kind of bad because if you're an aggressive player, you have two people against you. But I just thought it was so neat to see them working together like that. And I wasn't expected. They must have talked about it in the car or something because it wasn't like they openly talked about it, like said, we're going to do this. It was just kind of something that happened. So it was so cool to see. And well, we'll see what happens, but it would be interesting to be able to try this with somebody at some point.
I wonder if you have anyone in mind.
Ooh.
Okay. What do you think, Travis? What do you think about the strategy?
I think it is a rather unique and special strategy. I can see what the whole 2v1 situation though that can come from it. At the same time, though, like you said, they might be more of a target. I would argue against that, and just a little bit with the sense of if I attack one and they know that they're working together, the other one's going to attack me back. You know, it's going to be, hey, you attacked her or him, and we're allied. We're, matrimony here. I'm now going to attack you, right, and during my next turn, stuff like that. So I feel like it's a very slippery slope if you're if you're not playing this strategy.
Yeah, it's a very good point you made there about it being extremely toxic in the three-player context. And whenever we're talking about strategies of the passivity meta, we usually discuss it in context of 4 or more players, because that's usually where I say it's the game's most balanced. I usually say 4 to 6. This strategy is very unique, and I think is very effective. Like Mikey said, you'll usually see it happen where 2 players secretly agreed before the game to not target each other. You know, it's usually not. Usually, you don't discover it's happening until it's too late. It's the thing. Unless you're playing multiple games that day, they probably have a decent chance of winning that game. Is if 2 players on an alliance and then you have 2 other players, let's say, then it's 1v1 versus 2. The 2 players, one of those are likely to win. It's just how it is. The other scenario, which I have directly experienced, is where 2 players will agree to be on an alliance, and they'll do it openly at the start of the game, and they won't hide it from their opponents. What usually instantly happens, unless we're in an aggressive meta where no one trusts each other, is the other 2 players will also agree to be in an alliance, and all of a sudden we have a team game of Killer Bunnies where we have 2 versus 2. And in a larger context, that could be 2 versus 2 versus 2, it could be 3 versus 3. It creates very interesting scenarios. It's not just for married couples, although that's what the name is. Name is inspired by Hayden and Clarissa, of course. But it does work in other contexts as well, where all of a sudden you have the capability of creating a team versus team scenario in Killer Bunnies. And that's a really cool interaction. Until someone backstabs it, then it's sad, but
Yeah. That's the holy matrimony / divorce afterwards
yeah,
strategy.
that's a very specific application of backstab that we'll call the divorce
Oh,
strategy.
that's super toxic.
Oh yeah, it is. It is
Oh,
very
just wait.
toxic when you agree to ally with someone throughout the whole game, and all of a sudden you just crush
And
their dreams, and it's like, oh,
5 turns before the end of the game that you know it's going to end, you just go
oh,
off against them.
it's
Oh,
so mean, so mean.
is that
That's how you end
is that an
friendships
end
right
of
there.
a? Yeah, I was about to say, is that how you end a relationship?
I guess so, yeah, probably.
Ah,
Yeah.
toxic.
Oh, it can be. Killer mind strategies can be toxic if you it's just by nature of social interaction. Some social interactions are quite toxic in nature. Thankfully, we didn't have time to cover a lot of them in the aggressive discussion, but here we found one in neutral. Or more so the breaking of a neutral strategy. So yeah, holy matrimony is a very good strategy if used correctly. Um, it can be toxic. It's very toxic in a 3-player context. I would recommend, if you want to keep your friends, to anyone listening, if you want to keep that third wheel as your friend, you better not use this strategy against them. It's one thing to have a non-aggression pact, and this is a weird scenario where the aggressive strategy is actually less toxic than the neutral strategy. It's one thing to have a non-aggression pact, and where you just agree not to target each other, but there's possibility for backstab, and you're not really going to help each other either. You're just kind of going to leave each other alone, pretend each other doesn't exist. This
Yeah.
strategy, if you're on an alliance, full alliance with a player, and there's only one other opponent, we know what's going to happen. It's worse than the 3-player Jarnac scenario. So yeah, that's a fun one to end on, the holy matrimony. Very, very exciting strategy. I hope to see it explored more, because I think it's one of those strategies that has huge potential, but just isn't used very often.
The gears in my head are turning now, Matt.
That's good. That's the goal. I hope
I gotta remind myself for next Monday as well to ask you a question before we start. Wink,
Ooh,
wink, nudge,
ooh,
nudge.
questions. I like questions.
I need to put a reminder for myself now.
I feel like there's an alliance going to happen, or at least an unspoken non-aggression pact.
Oof.
Anything else we want to say before we close here?
Always keep them guessing.
Always keep
My
them
final
guessing.
words.
Well,
My
thank
final
you.
words.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the podcast today. Thank you, Travis, for guesting and being our expert on the neutral strategies. If anyone has future topic suggestions, although we have episodes planned out for the next 4 episodes, after that we are wide open for topic suggestions. And if you'd like to be a potential guest, contact me. We've established that smoke signals or homing pigeons are the best way to contact me, but the Discord works as well if you'd rather use that, or on Facebook. Anything you'd like to say, Mikey?
I would like to thank everybody for joining in and listening to the first and superior podcast on Killer Bunnies. And I say,
I think we can still say
yeah.
first and only, since Creator Chit Chat only happens like once a year.
Yeah, okay. Superior only, whatever. Jeff blessed.
Jeff
Jeff
bless.
Bless.